ideological control in the sciences and humanities, as well as the function of schools. Would you say that as academic disciplines, the sciences are fundamentally different from the humanities and social sciences in terms of ideological control? There doesn't seem to be the same kinds of barriers to inquiry or the same commitment to indoctrination in the scientific fields as there are in other areas, like in economics or political science, for instance. Well, I think there was an ideological control problem in the sciences. It's just that we transcended it. Galileo faced it. For example, the Italian astronomer and scientist was arrested by the Roman Catholic Church in 1633 and compelled to renounce his conclusion that the earth revolves around the sun. Then you can go back a couple centuries in the West, and the ideological control problem in the sciences was severe. Rene Descartes is alleged to have destroyed the final volume of his treatise on the world, the one that was supposed to deal with the human mind, because he learned of the fate of Galileo. That's the analog to death squads. The Inquisition was doing precisely that. Okay, that's passed in the West at least, but not everywhere. It is passed, I think, for a few reasons. One is just a general increase in freedom and enlightenment, one through popular struggles over centuries. We have become a much freer society than we were in absolutist times, and intellectuals have often played a role in that, breaking down ideological barriers, superstitious beliefs, and creating a kind of space for greater freedom of thought, for instance during the Enlightenment in the 18th century. That often took a lot of courage and quite a struggle, and it goes on until today. There are also utilitarian reasons. It turns out that, especially since the mid-19th century, the ability to gain a deeper understanding of the physical world through modern science has interacted critically with modern industrial development. Progress in the sciences has contributed materially to private profit-making, private power. So there are utilitarian reasons for allowing freedom of scientific inquiry, but I would not over-exaggerate them. I think that's happened with the sciences, and it is a lot like the process that has led to the freedom in other domains, like why we do not have slavery, let's say, or why after 150 years of American history, women won the right to vote in the year 1920. And also remember, after the great scientific revolutions that led to the Enlightenment, it was to the point where you couldn't do science anymore if you were subjected to the kinds of doctrinal controls that remain quite effective in other fields. And what I mean by this is if you are a physicist after Newtonian science trying to spin off ideological fanaticism, you are just out of the game. Progress has spun off ideological fanaticism, and progress has been too much. So that is very different from the social sciences and the humanities. You can tell falsehoods forever in those fields and nothing will ever stop you. You don't have Mother Nature around keeping you honest. And the result is there is a real difference in the two cultures. So when you go to graduate school in the natural sciences, you are immediately brought into critical inquiry. And in fact, what you are learning is a kind of craft. You don't really teach science. People sort of get the idea how to do it as apprentices, hopefully by working with good people in the applied sciences. But of course, the goal is to learn how to do creative work and to challenge everything. That is a very different perspective from the humanities and the social sciences, where what you are supposed to do is absorb a body of knowledge or a systematic study of knowledge and then pick yourself a little area within it and for the rest of your life work on that. I mean, the way you become a highly respected scholar in the humanities, say, is to pick some arcane area like English novels from 1720 to 1790 and then get to know more of the data about that than any other human being in all of history. And so you know who copied this word from that and so on. A lot of it is kind of mindless, but that's the sort of thing that you are supposed to know. And there is really very little intellectual challenge. The only way you could be wrong is if you got a comma out of place. And in fact, that's considered the worst crime, grammatical crimes. I'm kind of caricaturing it a bit, but frankly, I think it works this way, and certainly the sciences are very different. Concerning the function of schools, I don't see how this ideological control mechanism actually works in the humanities and social sciences. I mean, how exactly is it that the schools end up being an indoctrination system? We will describe this process in more detail. The main point, I think, is that the entire school curriculum, from kindergarten through graduate school, will be tolerated only so long as it continues to perform its institutional role. So take the universities, which in many respects are not very different from the media in the way they function, though they are a much more complex system, so they are harder to study systematically. Universities do not generate nearly enough funds to support themselves from tuition money alone. They are parasitic institutions that need to be supported from the outside, and that means they are dependent on wealthy alumni or alumnus, on corporations, and on the government, which are groups with the same basic interests. Well, as long as the universities serve those interests, they'll be funded. If they ever stop serving those interests, they will start to get in trouble. And so, for example, in the late 1960s, it began to appear that the universities were not adequately performing that service. Students were asking questions, they were thinking independently, they were rejecting a lot of the establishment value system, challenging all sorts of things, and the corporations began to react to that. They began to react in a number of ways. For one thing, they began to develop alternative programs, like IBM began to set up a kind of vocational training program to produce engineers on their own. If MIT wasn't going to do it for them the way they wanted, they'd do it themselves. And that would have meant they'd stop funding MIT. And so, well, of course, things never really got out of hand in the 60s, so the moves in that direction were very limited, but those are the kinds of pressures there are. And in fact, you can even see similar things right now. Take all this business about Alan Bloom and that book everybody's been talking about, The Closing of the American Mind. It's this huge bestseller. I don't know if you have looked at it. It's mind-boggling stupid. I read it once in the supermarket while I was shopping, and I sat there and read the damn thing, and it takes about 15 minutes to read. And what I mean by read, sort of turn the pages to see if there's anything there that isn't totally stupid. But that's the book, and it is basically saying that education ought to be set up like some sort of variant of the Marine Corps, in which you just march the students through a canon of great thoughts that are picked out for everyone. So some group of people will say, here are the great thoughts of Western civilization are in this corpus. You sit here and learn them, read them and learn them, and be able to repeat them. That's the kind of model Bloom is calling for. Well, anybody who's ever thought about education or been involved in it, or even gone to school, knows that the effect of that is that students will end up knowing and understanding virtually nothing. It doesn't matter how great the thoughts are. If they are simply imposed upon you from the outside and you are forced through them step by step, after you've done, you'll have forgotten what they are. What I mean by this is I'm sure that every one of you has taken any number of courses in school in which you worked, in which you did your homework, you passed the exam, maybe you got an A, and a week later you couldn't remember what the course was about. You only learn things and learn how to think if there's some purpose for learning, some motivation that's coming out of you somehow. And in fact, all of the methodology in education isn't really much more than that, getting students to want to learn. Once they want to learn, they will do it. But the point is that this model that Bloom and all these other people are calling for is just a part of the whole method of imposing discipline through the schools and of preventing people from learning how to think for themselves. And so, what you do is make students go through and sort of memorize a canon of what are called good books, which you force on them, and then somehow great things are supposed to happen. But it is a completely stupid form of education, but I think that's part of why it's selected and supported, and why there's so much hysteria that it's been questioned in past years, just because it's very functional to train people and discipline them in ways like this. The popularity of Bloom, I would imagine, is mostly a reaction to the sort of liberating effect that the student movement of the 60s and other challenges to the schools and universities began to have. And of course, all of Alan Bloom's great thoughts are by elite white males. Of course, yes, but it wouldn't even matter if he had some different array of material. It really wouldn't matter. The idea that there's some array of the deep thoughts and we smart people will pick them out and you dumb guys will learn them, or memorize them at least, because you don't really learn them if they're just forced on you. That's nonsense. If you're just serious about, say, reading Plato, at least reading all of his dialogues, it's fine to read Plato, but trying to figure out what's right, what's wrong, what's a better way of looking at it, why he's saying this when he should have been saying something else, what grotesque error of reasoning did he make over here, and so on and so forth. That's the way you would read serious work, just like you would in the sciences, but You are not supposed to read it that way here. You're supposed to read it because it's the truth, or it's the great thoughts of, or something, and that's kind of the worst form of theology. Of course, you don't. Theology doesn't have any kind of critical analysis whatsoever. And so the point is, it doesn't matter what you read. It matters how you read it. Now, I don't mean comic books. There's a lot of cultural wealth out there from all over the place, and to learn what it means for something to be culturally rich, you can explore almost anything anywhere. There's no fixed subset that is the basis of truth and understanding. What I mean by this is that you can read the good books and memorize what they said and forget them a week later. If it doesn't mean anything to you personally, you might as well not have read them. And it's very hard to know what's going on or what's going to mean something to different people. But there's plenty of exciting literature around in the world, and there's absolutely no reason to believe that unless you've read the Greeks and Dante and so on, you've missed things. I mean, yes, you've missed things, but you've also missed things if you haven't learned something about other cultural traditions as well. And so just take a look at philosophy, for example, and history, which is a field that I know something about. Some of the best, most exciting, most active philosophers and historians in the contemporary world, people who've made a real impact on the different fields, couldn't tell Plato from Aristotle except for what they remember from some freshman course that they once took. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't read Plato and Aristotle. Sure, there are millions of things you should read. Nobody's ever going to read more than a tiny fraction of the things that you wished you knew. But just reading them does you no good. You only learn if the material is integrated into your own creative processes somehow. Otherwise, it just passes through your mind and disappears. And there is nothing valuable about that. It is basically the effect of learning the catechism or memorizing the Constitution of the United States or something like that. Real education is about getting people involved in thinking for themselves, and that's a tricky business to know how to do well. But clearly it requires that whatever it is you're looking for or looking at has to somehow catch people's interest and make them want to think. And that is to make them want to pursue and to explore. And just regurgitating good books is absolutely the worst way to do it. That's just a way of turning people into automata. You may call that an education if you want, but it's really the opposite of an education, which is why people like William Bennett, who was Reagan's Secretary of Education, and Alan Bloom, and these others are all so much in favor of it. And so what I am saying is that the real purpose of universities and the schools is just to indoctrinate people, and really not much else. But I'm not really quite saying it like that. I wouldn't say that no meaningful work takes place in the schools, or that they only exist to provide manpower for the corporate system or something like that. These are very complex systems. But the basic institutional role and function of the schools and why they are supported is to provide an ideological service. There is a real selection for obedience and conformity, and I think that process starts in kindergarten. But let me just tell you a personal story. And so there was a person who came to the United States from Lativa when he was 15, fleeing from Hitler. He escaped to New York with his parents and went to George Washington High School, which in those days at least was the school for bright Jewish kids in New York City. And that he once said that the first thing that struck him about American schools was the fact that if he got a C in the course, nobody cared. But if he came to school 3 minutes late, he was sent to the principal's office, and that generalized. He realized that what it meant is, what is valued here is the ability to work on an assembly line, even if it's an intellectual assembly line. The important thing is to be able to obey orders, to do what you're told, to be where you're supposed to be. Values are, you are going to be a factory worker somewhere. Maybe they'll call it a university, but you're going to be following somebody else's orders and just doing your work in some prescribed way. And what matters is discipline, not figuring things out for yourself or understanding things that interest you. Those are kind of marginal. Just make sure you meet the requirements of a factory. And of course, that's pretty much what the schools are like. The schools are factories, I think. They reward discipline and obedience. They punish independence of mind. If you happen to be a little innovative, or maybe you forgot to come to school one day because you were reading a book or something, that's a tragedy. That's a crime. It's seen as that because you're not supposed to think. You're supposed to obey and just proceed through the material in whatever way they require. And so, in fact, most of the people who make it through the educational system and get into the elite universities are able to do it because they have been willing to obey a lot of stupid orders for years and years on end, for 12 years, and then at community colleges, and then at in four-year universities, and then in graduate schools, and then PhD programs. And that's the way that I did it as well. And so, like, you're told by some stupid teacher, do this, which you know makes no sense whatsoever, but you do it anyway. And if you do it, you get the next rung, and then you obey the next order, and then finally you work your way through and they give you your letters. An awful lot of education is like that from the very beginning. Some people go along with it because they figure, okay, I'll do any stupid thing that asshole says because I want to get that ahead. Others do it because they've just internalized the values, but after a while those two things tend to get sort of blurred, but you do it, or else you're out. You ask too many questions and you're going to get in trouble. You try to tell the system why it's an institutional failure and you get fired. Now, there are also people who don't go along, and they're called behavior problems. That's what I would be called, or unmotivated, or certain things like that. And while you don't want to be too glib about it, there are children with behavior problems, but a lot of them are just independent-minded, or don't like to conform, or just want to go their own way. And they get into trouble right from the very beginning, and they are usually typically weeded out. I mean, I've taught kids too. The fact is that there are some who just don't take your word for it, and the very unfortunate tendency is to try to beat them down because they are a pain in the neck. But what they ought to be is encouraged. Yes, why take my word for it? Who the hell am I? Figure it out for yourself. That's what real education would be about, in fact. Actually, I happen to have been very lucky myself and gone to an experimental progressive Deweyite school by the time I was age 6, for example. And there was done routinely. Children were encouraged to challenge everything, and you sort of worked on your own. And many people didn't go to those schools. I, for one, thought that I had, but I had not. And you were supposed to think through for yourself. And so that would have been a real experience. However, my education was not, and it was quite a striking challenge in high school, which is the pride of the city school system, the public educational system. It was a school for academically oriented kids. It was the dumbest, most ridiculous place I have been to in my entire life. It was like falling into a black hole or something like that. But for one thing, it was extremely competitive because that's one of the best ways of controlling people. And so everybody was ranked. You could always know exactly where you were. Are you third in the class, or maybe as you move down to fourth? All of this is put into people's heads in various ways in the schools, that you've got to beat down the person next to you and just look out for yourself. And there are all sorts of other things like that as well. But the point is, there's nothing necessary about them in education. I know because I went through the education, and so it can certainly be done. But given the external power structure of the society in which they function now, the institutional role of the schools for the most part is just to train people for obedience and conformity, to be uniform to a corporate entity, to make them controllable and indoctrinated. And as long as the schools fulfill that role, they will be supported. Now, of course, it doesn't work 100%, so you get some people all the way through who don't go along. And as I was saying, in the sciences at least, people have to be trained for creativity and disobedience, because there is no other way you can do science. But in the humanities and social sciences, and it feels like journalism and economics as well, that's much less true. There are people who have to be trained to be managers and controllers and to accept things and not to question too much. And so you really do get a very different kind of education. And people who break out of line are weeded out or beaten back in all kinds of ways. And I mean, it's not very abstract. If you are, I say, a young person in college, or for that matter, or a fourth grader, for example, you have too much of an independent mind, there's a whole variety of devices that will be used to deflect you from that error. And if you can't be controlled, to marginalize or just eliminate you. And in fourth grade, you are a behavior problem. In college, you may be irresponsible or erratic or not the right kind of student. If you make it to the faculty, you'll fail in what's sometimes called not getting along with your colleagues. If you're a young journalist and you're pursuing stories that people at the managerial level above you understand, either intuitively or explicitly, are not to be pursued, you can be sent off to work at the police desk and advised that you don't have proper standards of objectivity. And so there's a whole range of these techniques. And then if you don't file in line to the policy standards of the state, you'll be fired. And so now, we live in a free society. so you don't get sent to the gas chambers and they don't send death squads after you, as is commonly done and not far from here, say in Mexico. But there are nevertheless quite successful devices, both subtle and extreme, to ensure that doctrinal correctness is not seriously infringed upon.